The wind came low and restless across the plains that morning, moving like something that had forgotten how to sing. Dust rose in ribbons from the dry earth, curling around the weathered boots of Elias Ward as he leaned against the post outside his barn. The boards behind him were gray and tired, sun-bleached by years of unkind seasons. He had once painted them red for his wife, though the color had long faded. Everything he'd ever loved seemed to fade here, except the land which refused to die. He watched the horizon the way lonely men do, not looking for anything, just making sure it hadn't left him behind. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and iron. Inside the corral, a few cattle stood still, ribs showing through their hides. Elias's hands were cracked from work and wind, his beard salted with gray. He'd learned to move slow, to keep words to himself. In towns like Dry Creek, silence wasn't a choice, it was the last thing a man could afford to lose. The morning was thin and cold. He saddled his horse, a bay gelding that carried more miles than muscle now, and set out toward the southern ridge where the old fence line ran. His coat hung loose, heavy with dust and time. The trail was littered with tumbleweed and the pale bones of rabbits picked clean. He rode without hurry because hurry meant hope, and he had long outgrown that. A raven crossed above him, wings black against the sun. Its shadow skimmed the ground, the same dark line that lived in Elias's chest. He had once known laughter here, his wife Clara's hands, his boy's voice chasing calves through morning light. But both were gone. Fever had taken one, death the other. He kept their memories folded tight like old letters he never read. By noon the heat gathered low, the way it does before the wind turns cruel. Elias dismounted to check the wire near Miller's Bluff. The posts leaned, half-rotten from last winter's storms. He fixed them the way he fixed everything else, patiently, without pride. When he wiped the sweat from his brow, his sleeve came away brown with dust. That was when he heard it, a sound faint as breath carried from the hollow behind the ridge. It wasn't the call of cattle or the cry of coyotes. It was softer, broken like air catching on pain. He paused, hat tilted, listening. The wind shifted. Again the sound came, low, shuddering, unmistakably alive. He left the fence and followed it. The ground dipped into a small ravine, scattered with mesquite and the tracks of hooves not his own. The noise grew clearer, a weak, stifled whinny followed by silence. He moved carefully, stepping over brush until he saw it. A horse tethered to a dead tree, skin caked with dust, legs trembling under its own weight. The animal's flank was raw, a livid stripe slashed across its back where the whip had cut through skin. The welt was deep, dark against the pale hide, still wet near the edges. Elias stopped. For a long moment he didn't move. The breeze flicked the horse's mane across its eyes. It turned its head toward him, nostrils flaring, pupils wide with terror and exhaustion. He knelt slowly, his boots creaking in the dirt. The smell hit him first, the rot of blood and sweat mixed with rope and fear. Someone had done this recently. The rope around the tree was fresh, tight enough to blister the flesh beneath the halter. A brand mark showed faintly under the grime, half-burned, half-healed. Whoever had owned this animal had meant to break it or kill it trying. Elias reached out a hand, palm open. The horse flinched, then stilled. Its breath came in ragged bursts. The silence between them felt old, older than cruelty, older than forgiveness. He spoke quietly, his voice dry as the land itself. "Easy now," he said, the words almost a whisper. The horse blinked, one ear twitching toward him. He cut the rope with his knife. The fibers snapped, curling back like they were glad to be free. The horse staggered forward a step, then another, then stopped beside him, shaking. Elias ran a hand along its neck, feeling the tremor beneath the skin. The wound on its back pulsed with heat. Whoever had done this had meant for it to remember pain. He found a patch of shade under the bluff and poured water from his canteen into his palm. The horse drank, lips quivering against his skin. When it lifted its head, water dripped down its muzzle like tears that wouldn't fall. Elias stared at the mark on its back, the way the blood had dried into a single crooked line. It reminded him of something carved into wood, the kind of mark men leave when they think no one will ever look too close. He felt something stir in him that hadn't moved in years. Not anger, he'd forgotten how to burn that hot, but something quieter, colder. The old kind of grief that knows its way to the bones. He pressed his fingers into the wound's edge just enough to feel the raised tissue. The horse didn't pull away. He stood again, scanning the ridge for tracks. Hoofprints led north, deeper into the desert. Heavy, wide, spaced too far apart for a gentle ride. Whoever left this horse here had ridden off fast. Maybe they thought it would die before morning. Maybe they didn't care. Elias took the reins and started walking. The horse followed without being asked, limping slightly but steady. The sun dipped low as they climbed the slope toward his homestead. Dust hung behind them like a ghost that refused to vanish. At the barn, he cleared a space near the door, laid down fresh straw, and fetched what medicine he had: an old tin of salve, a bottle of iodine, a strip of linen torn from an old shirt. He cleaned the wound in silence, his hands steady though his chest ached with each breath. The horse's sides heaved, but it didn't resist. When the sting came, it only shivered like a person trying not to cry. Outside, the world softened. Dusk painted the sky with slow colors: amber, mauve, fading gold. The rancher moved in that light like a figure half remembered by the earth. He spoke again, softly, as if to himself. "You didn't deserve this." When the last of the light went, he hung his lantern near the stall. The horse's eyes reflected it, calm now, trusting. He sat beside the door, listening to the sound of breathing, the faint rustle of hay. The smell of iodine filled the air, clean and sharp. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Later, when he stepped outside, the night had turned cool and still. Stars scattered like frost across the sky. He looked toward the ridge again, the direction he'd come from, and saw nothing but darkness. Yet somewhere out there, a man with a whip slept easy, thinking the desert buried his sins. Elias leaned on the fence, the wood rough against his palms. He thought of Clara again, her voice, her mercy, the way she'd once stopped him from putting down a lame foal. "You can't fix everything," she'd said, "but you can choose not to be cruel." The memory cut through him like wind through dry grass. He turned back toward the barn. The lantern flickered, its glow spilling over the horse's scarred back. The mark caught the light, ugly, unforgettable. It looked almost deliberate, a brand of pride turned to shame. He realized then that he couldn't ride into town tomorrow pretending nothing had changed. The scar on that animal's back had carved something into him too. He didn't know whose hand had swung the whip or why, but he knew what cruelty looked like and what silence cost. The horse shifted in the straw, a slow, tired movement. Elias watched her for a long while, his breath matching hers. The desert outside seemed to wait with them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, low and lonely, its echo swallowed by the night. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, feeling the slow thud of his heart beneath. The wind pushed through the broken boards of the barn, humming like a memory trying to speak. When he finally walked back inside, he whispered the first word that came to him: "Grace." The horse lifted its head, ears turning toward him. A faint, uncertain light crossed its eyes, something between fear and faith. He smiled, tired but sure. Outside, the horizon flickered with the thin promise of dawn. The air smelled of dust and salt and change. Somewhere beyond that ridge, the man who had wielded the whip was still out there. And whether Elias meant to or not, he had just stepped into the path that would lead him straight toward him. Morning crept in slow and gold, sliding through the cracks in the barn like it was afraid to disturb the quiet. Elias had not slept. He sat on a wooden crate, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the horse that now stood trembling but alive in the straw. The lantern had burned out hours ago, leaving only the thin gray of dawn and the scent of iodine, hay, and dust. The wound across her back had stopped bleeding, dark and crusted now, but raw enough that every twitch looked like pain still lived in her skin. He spoke to her softly, voice roughened by the night. "You made it through, girl." The words were more to himself than her. He lifted a pail of water toward her mouth. She hesitated, then drank, slow and cautious. Her breath steamed in the cold. Elias watched her throat move, the rhythm of survival steady and beautiful. When she finished, he set the bucket down and rubbed her neck gently, tracing the ridge of her bones under the hide. "Grace," he whispered again, testing the name like it might break if he said it too loud. The sound of it seemed to calm her. He spent the morning cleaning the stall, fetching more straw, and boiling rags in a tin pot to make them clean enough for the wound. His movements were slow but sure, guided by instinct more than knowledge. He'd doctored calves, broken mustangs, patched men's arms during cattle drives, but this was different. The silence around this creature was thick, sacred even. It made him work like a man repairing something that once held meaning. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The wind carried a faint smell of sagebrush and distance. Grace lifted her head toward it, nostrils flaring. For the first time, she stepped forward on her own, testing the weight of her legs. Elias watched the movement, a small miracle hidden in the ordinary. She limped slightly, but she didn't fall. He fetched a handful of oats from the bin, letting her eat from his open palm. Her muzzle brushed his skin, soft and warm. He felt the same ache he'd once felt holding his son's tiny hand, the tenderness that came before the fear of losing it. He didn't know yet what debt he'd just taken on, only that something inside him had shifted. The barn no longer felt like a shelter for ghosts. By noon he decided to look for the brand more closely. The light showed clearer now, cutting across her back like truth against a lie. The scarred flesh had letters, partial, burned crooked, but he could make out one thing, a capital T framed by a circle. He'd seen that mark before. Warren Tull. Elias straightened slowly. The name settled on him like ash. Tull owned half the breeding stock in Dry Creek County, a man whose money came from gambling, cruelty, and fear. Elias had done business with him once years ago, sold 2 mares to pay his taxes. The memory stung. Tull had laughed when he'd offered too little, saying, "A horse don't need kindness to run, it needs command." Elias remembered those words now like poison turning in the blood. He spent the next day nursing Grace, rubbing her legs with oil, brushing her mane. She began to respond to his voice, her ears turning toward him whenever he spoke. The barn grew quieter, more alive somehow. Even the wind outside seemed to ease its edge. He found himself talking more, to her, to the emptiness, to whatever part of himself still believed in decency. "You're safe here," he said one night, though safety was never something he could promise anyone. A week passed. Grace grew stronger, her coat beginning to shine again beneath the scabs. But Elias knew recovery didn't erase what had been done. Pain had a way of teaching memory how to breathe. Each time she flinched at the crack of a whip in town or the slam of a gate, he saw the mark twitch beneath her skin. He began to wonder who had swung that whip, one of Tull's hired hands or the man himself. The thought gnawed at him. He hadn't cared about other men's cruelty in years. The world was full of it, and the desert had taught him to look away. But now, with this creature under his roof looking to him for comfort, he found himself unable to stay silent. On the 8th morning he saddled his horse and rode into town. Grace watched from the corral, her head tilted, mane catching the wind. The road to Dry Creek stretched long and straight, lined with dead grass and barbed wire. The town was waking when he arrived. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of wagon wheels, the bitter smell of whiskey spilling from the saloon. He tied his horse near the feed store and stepped inside. Old men played cards in the corner, their laughter dry as sand. Behind the counter the storekeeper looked up. "Well, Elias Ward," he said. "Haven't seen you in months. What brings you down off your ridge?" "Feed," Elias said simply. "And information." The man's brow lifted. "About?" "A silver mare. White face. Circle T brand. You seen her before?" The storekeeper's smile faltered. He wiped his hands on a rag. "You best not ask too many questions about Tull's animals. Folks who do tend to end up regretting the curiosity." "I'm not curious," Elias replied. "Just want to know where she came from." The man hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "That mare ran in Tull's stables. Beautiful thing, strong. Lost a race last month over in Carson Wells. They say Tull took it bad, blamed the animal. Sent her off to be taught respect." He lowered his voice. "But she didn't come back. Some of his boys said she got loose. Others said she didn't." Elias nodded, though his jaw tightened. He paid for the feed and left without another word. Outside the heat pressed down, smelling of dust and iron. He felt a storm rising somewhere behind his ribs. At the edge of town he stopped by the farrier's shed. A young boy, maybe 12, was sweeping the porch. "You worked for Tull once?" Elias asked. The boy froze, broom still in hand. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter. Just tell me, did you ever see a silver mare there?" "Scar on her back." The boy's eyes flicked toward the road as if checking for witnesses. "I saw him do it," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "She wouldn't take the bit. He whipped her till she went down. Said he'd sell her for meat. Next morning she was gone." Elias stood very still. The boy swallowed. "You didn't hear that from me." He walked away without a word. The air burned hot around him, full of flies and memory. Each step back to his horse felt heavier than the one before. By the time he reached his ranch, the sky had turned copper. Grace was waiting near the fence, ears pricked, tail swishing. When she saw him, she gave a small, soft sound, a half whinny, half sigh. He set down the feed and stood beside her. The sun fell low, spilling gold across the scar on her back. He ran his hand over it slowly. The skin was rough, healed but still ugly. "They hurt you because they could," he murmured. "And maybe that's what needs ending." The wind picked up, tugging at his coat as if echoing the thought. That night, after he bedded her down, he sat at the table with a bottle and a single candle. The flame leaned left in the draft. He opened an old notebook, his wife's, and wrote a line on the first blank page, found her marked by a man's cruelty, keeping her till she remembers kindness. He closed it, the words still ringing in his mind. The next evening, while the stars were bright and the crickets loud, a sound came from the dark beyond the fence. Slow, deliberate. Then a voice, low and hard, "You've got something that belongs to me." Elias stepped outside, the lantern's glow stretching long across the yard. A rider sat motionless beyond the fence line, hat brim shadowing his face. The horse under him shifted restlessly. Elias said nothing. The rider spat into the dirt. "I'll be back tomorrow. You best have her ready." He turned and rode off, hooves thudding into the night. Elias watched until the sound faded. Behind him, Grace shifted in the barn, restless again. The scar on her back glimmered under the light like a warning. He tightened his grip on the lantern. The flame trembled but didn't die. Inside, the air felt colder. He closed the barn door, stood beside the horse and whispered, "He's coming for you." Then after a moment, almost to himself, he added, "But he'll have to come through me first." The night passed without sleep. Elias sat by the window, lantern low, rifle leaning against the wall. Outside, the world held its breath. The horse in the barn shifted sometimes, the creak of boards and soft snort reminding him she was still there, alive, waiting. Every sound beyond the fence made him lift his head. But no rider came. The stars dimmed, one by one, until dawn unfolded across the plain, pale as ash. He rose before the sun cleared the ridge, the silence between darkness and day heavy with warning. He moved to the barn and found Grace standing alert, her head high, mane tangled with straw. The wound on her back had scabbed into a dark, stubborn scar. When she saw him, she made that same soft sound, neither fear nor comfort, just recognition. He brushed her coat gently, his hands moving like someone tracing old memories. "You're safe," he said, but even as he spoke the words, he didn't believe them. By mid-morning he'd hitched his wagon, filled a water cask, and saddled his horse. The decision had taken no words, only the long, slow acceptance of what needed doing. He couldn't wait for the man to return. Some men came for revenge. Others came for what they believed was theirs. The ones like Tull didn't stop until someone stood in their way. He left Grace in the corral, watching as she paced behind the rails, uneasy. "I'll come back," he said softly. "I promise." Then he rode out, the wheels creaking, the road dust curling up behind him like a trail of ghosts. The town was 30 miles off, small and sunburned, built around a single crooked street where everything worth knowing hid behind silence. He passed the saloon first, its doors flapping in the wind. A pair of men leaned outside smoking, their eyes following him without curiosity, only recognition. Everyone knew a man who rode with purpose in a place where most didn't. He stopped at the sheriff's office, a squat building with a porch that leaned like it wanted to fall. The sheriff, Clay Henders, sat inside with his boots on the desk, hat pulled low. Elias stood in the doorway, shadow cutting across the floor. "Morning," he said. Henders grunted, not looking up. "Ward, what trouble brings you down?" "I got a horse that ain't mine. Found her tied up, left for dead. Circle T brand." That made the sheriff's eyes flick open. He sat up slow. "You sure about that brand?" "I've known Tull's mark since I sold him my stock years back." The sheriff sighed, rubbed his face. "Then you best return it. Tull don't take kindly to thieves." Elias's voice stayed level. "He whipped her near to death." Henders stood, his chair scraping. "That's between him and his property. You got no call meddling in it." Something inside Elias hardened, a small knot of disbelief turning sharp. "Property don't bleed like that," he said. The sheriff's gaze narrowed. "You're fixin' to make enemies you can't afford." "I already buried the ones I cared about," Elias said quietly. Then he turned, leaving the office before Henders could answer. He walked down the street toward the blacksmith's. Sparks jumped like fireflies in the dim shop, the ring of hammer against steel steady as a heartbeat. The blacksmith, a broad man named Jonas Pike, looked up from his work. "Ward," he said. "Heard you found a mare that ain't yours." "Word travels fast," Elias said. "Tull was here yesterday. Said someone stole from him. Offered coin for her return." Jonas's eyes met his. "He means business." Elias studied the anvil, the glow beneath the iron. "You ever see what he does to his horses?" Jonas set down his hammer. "I seen enough to know not to look twice. Men like him, they think pain's a kind of control." He hesitated. "You plan to keep her?" "I plan to keep her safe." Jonas nodded once, slow. "Then you best watch your back." Elias left town by dusk. The wind picked up again, curling around the rooftops like warning smoke. He didn't look back. The road stretched empty, but his chest carried weight, a tension that had no place to rest. He camped halfway home by a dry creek bed, the stars hard and white above him. As he sat by the small fire, he pulled a folded page from his coat, his wife's old letter, the one she'd written before the fever took her. Her handwriting was thin but steady. "Mercy is never wasted, Eli. Even if the world forgets it." He read it twice, then tucked it back into his pocket. The flames made the paper glow briefly, like a heartbeat. By the next afternoon he reached his land again. The gate was open. His pulse quickened. He spurred his horse forward. The barn door hung half ajar, one hinge twisted loose. Inside, straw was scattered, the trough overturned. Grace was gone. The sound that escaped him wasn't anger. It was something deeper, quieter, the exhale of disbelief that comes when a man realizes the world has found him again. He searched the ground, found hoof prints leading north, 2 horses, one heavy, one light. He followed. The trail wound through dry gullies and rock beds. By evening he spotted smoke on the horizon, a campfire. He dismounted, tied his horse, and crept forward on foot. The camp sat in a small clearing between mesquite trees. A man knelt near the fire, face hidden under a hat. Grace was tied nearby, rope around her neck again, eyes wide, breath fast. Elias recognized the man even before the hat lifted. Warren Tull, older than he remembered but just as mean in the eyes. His coat gleamed with wealth that didn't belong in this country, polished boots, gold chain glinting in the firelight. Elias stepped from the shadows. "You lost something," he said. Tull's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. Then he looked up, a grin spreading. "Ward, I was hoping you'd come. Saves me the trouble. You left her to die." Tull laughed softly. "She was weak. Weak things don't last long out here." Elias's voice stayed calm. "Maybe not. But cruel ones shouldn't either." Tull stood. "You forget your place. You ain't law. You ain't owner. You're just a fool who can't mind his own business." He took a step closer, his shadow crossing the fire. "You got one chance to walk away." Elias didn't move. The fire crackled between them, red light flickering on the whip handle hanging from Tull's belt. Grace shifted, rope tightening against her neck. That sound, her strangled breath, broke something final in him. He moved faster than he thought he could, reaching for the rope. Tull shouted, lunging, but Elias shoved the rope free. Grace reared, kicking up dust, knocking Tull backward. The horse bolted into the darkness, vanishing into the scrub. Tull scrambled to his feet, face twisted. "You'll regret that," he spat. "Maybe," Elias said. "But I'll sleep tonight." He turned and walked toward his horse, the moonlight spilling silver across the land. Behind him, Tull cursed, his voice fading into the wind. By the time Elias reached home, the stars had wheeled high again. He searched the horizon until dawn and finally saw her, Grace, standing on the ridge, watching him from a distance. She walked down slow, as if testing whether he was still real. He opened the gate and she stepped through, head low, calm again. He ran a hand down her neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "You're safe," he said once more, though this time it felt truer. But peace didn't linger. Days later, a rider brought a folded paper to his gate, official, sealed with the county mark. A notice. Unlawful possession of property belonging to Warren Tull. To appear before the circuit judge in Carson Wells. Elias read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his coat. His eyes drifted to the scar on Grace's back, to the quiet steadiness in her gaze. The kind that carried both pain and endurance. He realized the fight ahead wasn't about one horse anymore. It was about every living thing left at the mercy of men who called cruelty ownership. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the barn door. Grace paced inside, uneasy. Elias sat by the window, the paper on the table, the lamp's flame bending under the draft. He whispered into the stillness, voice steady as the ticking clock on the wall. "All right then." Outside, lightning flickered far off over the plains, painting the horizon in ghost-white flashes. Somewhere in that distance, Warren Tull was smiling, certain victory already belonged to him. Elias watched the light fade and reached for his hat. The fire inside him no longer felt like anger, it was purpose, bright and cold. The kind that doesn't fade when morning comes. The courthouse sat like a slab of stone at the edge of Carson Wells, a 2-story relic from better years. The windows were clouded by dust, the flag above it faded to near white. Elias arrived at dawn, his wagon empty but for the horse that had brought all this upon him. Grace stood tied beneath the awning, her coat brushed, mane clean, scar still visible as a faint silver line across her back. The mark of cruelty had healed, but it had not vanished. Neither had his reason for being here. He stepped inside, hat in hand. The room smelled of oil lamps and old timber, the air thick with the stillness of people who had already chosen sides. Tull was there, seated with his lawyer, an arrogant man in a stiff collar, the kind who could twist law into rope. Tull's boots gleamed, his confidence brighter still. The sheriff sat behind them, pretending neutrality. A handful of ranchers whispered in the back row, glancing between the two men like gamblers choosing where to place their bets. Elias took his place at the defendant's table. No lawyer, no allies. Just him, his hat, and a worn notebook tucked under his arm. He had written everything in it, the dates, the witnesses, the scars that could not speak for themselves. When the judge entered, the murmurs stopped. His gavel fell like a dry branch breaking. "Mr. Ward," the judge began, "you stand accused of withholding property belonging to Mr. Warren Tull. How do you plead?" Elias's voice carried steady through the quiet. "Not guilty. The horse was abandoned, beaten, left to die." Tull leaned forward. "You admit to taking her, then?" "I admit to saving her." The lawyer rose, all smiles and polish. "Your Honor, sentiment is not law. The Circle T Ranch brands its horses for clear ownership. This man interfered with property not his own. There's no debate here, only pity disguised as theft." The judge nodded once but said nothing. He gestured for Elias to speak. Elias stood, his shoulders square but his hands trembling slightly. "I found her tied to a dead tree south of my land. The whip marks were still wet. No man who calls himself a horseman would have done that. And no man who's seen cruelty should pretend it doesn't concern him." A low stir moved through the room. The judge raised his hand for quiet. "Do you have proof of these injuries?" Elias set the notebook on the table and opened it. Inside were sketches, notes, and a single photograph, faded but clear enough. The mare's wound, her ribs, her eyes wide with fear. He'd borrowed a camera from the blacksmith weeks ago, knowing this day would come. The image spoke louder than his voice ever could. The lawyer frowned, stepping forward. "A picture can't prove who caused it." Elias looked at Tull. "Maybe not. But it proves what someone was willing to ignore." Tull smirked. "You think a scar makes me guilty? Horses bruise easy, Ward. That's how you teach them respect." Elias's voice dropped lower, roughened by disgust. "You don't teach respect by killing the soul of what trusts you." For a moment even the judge seemed to forget himself. Then Tull laughed, the sound echoing sharp against the walls. "You talk like a preacher, but all I see is a fool who can't mind his business." "I did mind it," Elias said. "My business is decency." The courtroom murmured again. Some of the ranchers shifted, uneasy. A woman in the back, one of Tull's former stable hands though few knew it, rose quietly. "It's true," she said. "He beats them. I seen it. Not just that one. The foals too." The lawyer tried to object, but the judge allowed her words. She went on, trembling, her voice small but clear. "He calls it breaking, but what he does ain't breaking. It's destroying." Tull turned red. "You're fired, girl. You never work for me again, you hear?" The judge slammed the gavel. "Enough." His gaze shifted between them, weighing more than evidence. "Mr. Tull, did you leave this horse to die?" Tull adjusted his collar, sneer tightening. "I left her where she belonged. She was useless. A man has a right to dispose of his property." The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Elias's eyes lifted to the bench. If cruelty's a right, then the law's already broken. The judge's gavel struck once more, sharp as lightning. "Order." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This court exists for law, not mercy, but sometimes the two are the same." He turned to Tull. "You had no claim to that animal once you left it to perish. This case is dismissed." The sound of that word, dismissed, rang through the room like a bell. Tull shot to his feet, shouting, but the sheriff's hand landed on his arm. The man who'd been untouchable suddenly looked small. The crowd murmured, half in disbelief, half in relief. Elias didn't smile. He only nodded once, then gathered his notebook and turned to leave. He passed Tull on his way out. The man's voice followed him, low and venomous. "You think this is over, old man? The law don't change hearts." Elias paused at the doorway. "Maybe not. But hearts change what men do with law." Outside the air was colder. The wind carried the smell of rain coming from the south. Grace waited where he'd left her, calm, her breath steaming. As he placed a hand on her neck, thunder rolled faintly across the plains. "Let's go home," he whispered. They rode out before the clouds broke, the first drops falling on the dirt road, darkening it like ink spreading across paper. Behind them, the courthouse faded into gray. The world felt larger again, unrolled by men's pride. Hours later, the storm found them on the ridge. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the desert in brief, wild glimpses. Grace moved steady despite the wind, her hooves sure on the muddy ground. Elias pulled his coat tighter, head low against the rain. They reached the barn at dusk, drenched, both shaking but alive. He dried her down, brushed her coat, whispered things he couldn't say to people. Gratitude mostly. Forgiveness maybe. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the storm move off over the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet not as loneliness but as peace. But peace is fragile in a place that's built on pride. 3 nights later, when the wind was still and the stars hung cold above the plains, he woke to the sound of hooves again, distant, then nearer. He rose, lit the lamp, and stepped onto the porch. The dark stretched endless in every direction. Then, faintly, the smell of smoke reached him. He turned toward the barn. The roof glowed orange. He ran barefoot through the dirt, heart pounding. Flames licked through the boards, sparks tearing into the sky. Inside, Grace screamed, a terrible human sound. He grabbed a blanket, threw it over his head, and forced the door open. The heat punched him back, but he went in anyway. The stall was half collapsed, fire crawling up the beams. Grace thrashed, trapped by a fallen rail. "Hold still, girl," he shouted, coughing, choking on smoke. He heaved the beam aside, his hands burning, skin tearing against the splintered wood. The mare stumbled free, her eyes wide with terror. Together they staggered through the doorway as the roof gave way behind them. Outside, the night exploded in orange and ash. Elias fell to his knees, gasping. Grace stood trembling beside him, her flanks scorched, but alive. The fire roared, devouring everything he owned. Behind the blaze, through the shimmering heat, he saw movement. A rider turning away, the glint of a silver spur catching the light before vanishing into the dark. He didn't give chase. He only watched, his breath breaking, the truth already carved deep inside him. Tull had lost in daylight and returned in shadow. Some men couldn't bear to lose anything they thought they owned. When dawn came, the barn was gone, only black beams and the smell of wet ashes left behind. Elias stood amid the ruin, hat in hand, clothes torn, skin blistered. Grace limped beside him, the smoke curling from her mane. Together they looked out toward the open plain, where the fire's trail met the horizon. He spoke softly, more vow than whisper. "They can burn the shelter, but not what's worth saving." His voice shook, but his eyes did not. Grace nuzzled his shoulder, her breath steady against the morning chill. The sky blushed pale pink, the first light of another fight already gathering. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Tull still breathed, certain the fire had ended it. But Elias had nothing left to lose now, only something to protect. And men like that, the kind who fight without wanting reward, are the hardest kind to stop. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke away, leaving only earth and the faint promise of rain. Elias turned toward what was left of his land, toward the open road stretching beyond it, and for a moment, the world was quiet except for the sound of one horse breathing beside one man, both scarred, both unbroken, both ready for whatever came next.